Brian will introduce our speaker, Dr. Mania.
So our speaker today is Dr. Kagan. Dr. Kagan is a sociologist of education, currently a postdoctoral research fellow at Perry World House, University of Pennsylvania. Her research focuses primarily on refugee and migrant children education and rights, particularly in urban contexts. She earned a PhD at the School of Education at Ben Gurion University in the Negev, Israel, which focused on the schooling of urban children, urban refugee children in Uganda. The dissertation, together with a few other projects focusing on other aspects of refugee policy and education in Uganda, is the basis for an upcoming book with Routledge Press. Her, her background is in comparative religions, international development, and a teaching diploma in arts. She has also worked and volunteered with and studied with refugee children's access and support to education in Israel, coming from Eritrea, Sudan, and the Ukraine into Israel. Afro-Caribbean migrants in the U.S., Ukrainian refugees in Poland. Dr. Kagan has conducted studies on education and development in East Africa, primarily in Uganda, Kenya, and Burundi, focusing on teacher training, low-fee private schools, alternative schools, and migration and development policies. She is on the board of several NGOs, including Israel Aid, Resilience Teaching, and Anye, as well as ERC Research Project entitled Afterlives of Development Interventions, Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique, and is a lecturer at RSUC, Norway, and BGU, Israel. She has also co-edited a volume entitled Development in Africa, From Theory to Practice, with Pardes Publications, and she is the current co-editor of the AAA childhood publication, NEOS, and a guest editor of contemporary displacement issues at Hagar.
Thank you, Brian. Now I request Franklin to read the abstract of our presentation.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I think you can hear me. I'm going to read out abstract of the paper of Dr. Mayna. The title of the paper is Generate and Grounded Theory, Navigating Conflict and Integration Perspectives, Refugee, Commodification, and Vulnerability in Primary School in Uganda. Abstract. This research examines the integration experience of refugee children in primary schools in Uganda in the context of the country's open door policy and rapid urban growth. Based on a comparative case study of 3 primary schools in Kampala and including 110 interviews with children, staff, and parents. This article examines how international and local refugee policy shape the integration of refugee children in school and in the community. On the other hand, refugees and their children in particular are considered vulnerable by international organizations and given targeted aid and attention. But on the other hand, the Ugandan government expressed and discursively describes urban refugees to be self-reliant and independent. This conflicting perspectives impact school dynamics, sometimes causing the refugee category to become a commodity, a privilege, or something to be avoided. The real and imagined benefits that refugees have access to and contribute to their school and community influence how they are perceived and how they perceive themselves. These shape how they are constructed in the community, and the school emphasizing that the meanings that the refugee category has are dynamic and fluid. I find that schools and at state and international refugee discourse and donor-targeted aid changes power dynamics. However, in the context of which states and inclusive policy, the implications of carrying a refugee label must be contextualized. Following school staff strategies of support, this suggests that vulnerability, especially in global urban South contexts, should be reconsidered and contextualized. This paper looks critically at the role of UNHCR in the way that refugee children are accepted and the intended consequences that international financial regimes and legacies of Western perspectives on the vulnerability and deservedness have on the ways schools in Uganda operate. Although this study focuses on south-to-south migration, we see that this continue to shape interactions on the ground in ways that often misalign with local values of community participation, the geopolitical contents of the host community, as well as the socio-economic challenges facing both the families and the institutions. Thank you.
Thank you.
I had the honor of meeting Rey at the conference in Germany, and I'm very happy to be invited here. Thank you so much for having me. So I'll be presenting a paper that is based on part of my dissertation, my PhD dissertation, where I focused on, you're welcome to stop and ask questions. I can't hear, the sound is not very good, so just let me know and ask questions if you would like to, please. Okay, so I did my dissertation. I worked on the question of integration of refugee children in primary schools in Uganda, in Kampala. And in this paper specifically, I focus on kind of the dynamics, how policy and NGOs influence integration. Yeah, you can pass on the next one. That's good. So I'll be really talking a bit about the theoretical kind of background for the study, the research questions, the arguments, the case study, and the research design, and then I'll focus a bit on the methodology, and you're welcome to ask questions really more technical. If it's something that relates to your research, I'd be happy to talk about that and some of the findings. Yeah. Please, if you could. Yeah, the next one. Perfect. So yeah, just in general, I don't know if this is interesting or I just wanted to share that these were kind of what I came into into my PhD thinking that these are the topics that interest me. And I think in PhD research, and I don't know if other people in the room would agree or not, but it's a big project and you can do many things. And your articles and chapters each kind of relate to different issues. And so really broadly, my research agenda, I'm a sociologist of education. I think that's how I see myself in terms of my discipline. But I do work, I'm really interested in how different international policies and development issues and aid organizations and migration reforms affect educational spaces, and also issues of injustice and justice in urban spaces, and what resources marginalized populations receive or not. And it's often in the sphere of refugee and migrant education, also because I believe it's a very important issue, but also because it allows us to look at these other topics as well. So the study today, if you could put the next slide. So this is just a general, I just wanted to share some kind of the studies that I'm doing that you could say, maybe other people don't see their connection, but in me, they all connect. So when you choose your PhD, research question, you can take it into many different directions. So that I just wanted to share. You could put the next slide. So yeah, today I'm really focusing on specifically on how schools as educational institutions interpret and enact refugees integration discourse in their schools in Kampala, Uganda. You can go on to the next one. So first of all, theoretically, if we think about refugee children, it's an interesting topic because on the one hand, refugee children, we believe that children should be protected regardless of who they were born to or where they were born to, and they're not to be blamed for what their parents have done. Yeah, please. Someone had a question? Okay. So on the one hand, we believe that refugee children should, as all children, should receive access to education, should have rights of protection. But on the other hand, even if the refugee children themselves are not excluded, they experience exclusion as part of the community that they're part of. When their parents are excluded from certain rights, they also experience that. So they're really caught in this tension. And in schools specifically, schools which as organizations, you can go on to the next slide. Schools are organizations that educate our next generation, right? They educate the citizens of the country, on the one hand, and people in the schools constantly kind of, I don't know, if battle over this, right? What kind of citizens, what kind of adults do we want to create? Next, please. And teachers are the ones that are there that need to implement this policy, right? These ideas that the government brings, or kind of these ideals of nationality. And their job, right, generally is to kind of educate children and socialize into becoming citizens, right? But in the case of refugees, they're caught in this kind of problem because they're teaching children who most likely will not become citizens, right? And then they're faced with these dilemmas that their professional values as people who are committed to teaching children on the one hand, but also they have their own political beliefs about migration, about these people specifically, whether they should be there, they shouldn't be there. And they're also caught in this kind of obligation towards the state, towards which they work to, or the curriculum in the classroom. So yeah, could you, next slide, please. Next one. Thank you. So in refugee studies, we can really see all of this kind of come into practice, and we can really ask questions about how refugee policy or migration media discourse about refugees, as we can see in many countries, right? How all of that affects what the children are actually experiencing in the classroom, how teachers, you know, act towards them. Do they support their education? Do they belittle them? You know, are they facing discrimination in the classroom? That all comes into the school. So I'm really interested in integration from this point of view, and I think from studying refugees, we can really learn not only about migration, but also about nation-state ideals, how they perceive children, and also about social equity and justice. Next slide, please. So I won't go into this for too long, but really I kind of focus on this idea of integration, which I'm sure you've all heard this word before. This is what politicians say, right? This is what UN says. Everyone says this word, and it means a different thing for everyone. But it's somewhere in between assimilation, right? Which is this idea that when a migrant comes into a new country, they have to become like the people that like the society that they're living in. And on the other side, multiculturalism, which is this is very, like, bluntly speaking, right? It's more complicated than that, but in broad terms, multiculturalism is this idea that many cultures live one alongside each other, but they don't really mix oftentimes. And integration is supposed to be something in between those, and these are new ideas, of course, that it's a two-way process. It's not just the refugees or the migrants that have to make an effort, but also the host community has to change and adapt towards people who are coming in. And as I mentioned before, everyone says this word. Some scholars argue that it's intentionally vague so that we could get people at the table at the same time. And if we talk about education, there's really this kind of view of integration, which is a bit more quantitative, where we think about how many children are enrolled in schools, how many children pass examinations, but we can also think about it in terms of well-being and belonging in the classroom. Next slide, please. Okay. So in this paper, I'm asking what strategies are schools using to accommodate and support refugee children, considering domestic and international policy. And I will talk about this unique policies in Uganda in relation to that. And how do refugee policy categories of self-reliance and vulnerability shape the way urban refugees in Uganda shape staff's approach? Yeah, how this shapes the ways educators, the teachers, and other staff approach them. Okay, so I'll start with the arguments and then I'll build my way from there. So I argue that in Kampala, schools strategically deploy different categories regarding refugees and, in a sense, utilize or use these refugee pupils as an asset to the school. And schools enact both state policy towards refugee discourse and also international integration discourse. And when I say international, I mean mostly international donors and UNHCR-led discourse. And I argue that donor-targeted aid changes power dynamics in the school and in the community by labeling who is deserving. And I believe that these rigid policy categories refugees, locals, all of these categories, both migrant and, host, all of those they fail to capture real life dimensions that educators encounter and challenges correlations between deservingness and vulnerability, which are made in the policy. And I argue that in the case of Uganda and maybe other weak state contexts where social services are not so strong and where there's inclusive policy, have changed the implications of being a refugee in this context. So, for example, in Uganda, where there's not so many social services and the policy is very inclusive towards refugees, it changes what it means to be a refugee. It's not the same image or category as we would think, for example, in Europe. And I think that in urban global south context more broadly, we need alternative regulatory frameworks of vulnerability because of the urban context. Okay, so the case study, kind of bringing the case study of Uganda into the context. So the study focuses on global south to south migration. As you probably know, this is studied much less than global south migration towards the north. And just in terms of the numbers, if we think about sub-Saharan Africa specifically, 84% of migrants stay in Africa and 16% go to North America and the US and Australia. If you look at the research, you would see that maybe 95% focus on Africans fleeing towards Europe. So I think that's definitely a misrepresentation of what's happening in reality. And research still tends to focus on refugee camps when we think about sub-Saharan Africa and also other global south contexts, while in reality, 60% of refugees are now living in cities. And in this case, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of research done on how many children speak the language, enroll into schools, but not much is done about what the experiences of the children themselves are, and especially their social kind of interactions with the hosting community. And I think Uganda, like other countries that are, outside of Europe, US, there's a different history of how the state was created and also different perceptions of what normative migration is and what kind of adults children are expected to be. And I think that all of that influences their experiences. Okay. So I think I did mention this. Yeah, so 85% of refugees live in the global south. And just to see the trend, this is like south migration compared to south-north migration. So as we can see, there's more south migration movements in the world than south to north migration, despite what you would think if you look at the news. So I think that definitely deserves more attention. Please. Okay, so I think Uganda is a particularly interesting case because Uganda actually has a very open door policy. Now, what that means is that refugees in Uganda, first of all, they receive refugee status. They are free to move. They are free to work. They receive the same national services as nationals, so the same educational facilities, the same health services, licenses, businesses, all of that. In many ways, you could say that it's almost the same, the rights that citizens and refugees receive. Refugees cannot become citizens, they can't be naturalized, but in all other senses, I think their rights in the country are very close. So I was really interested in seeing what happens when there is open door policy. What happens? There's not many cases of that. So this is why I focused on Uganda. Another reason is really that it's one of the top five refugee hosting countries. It's closer to 1.6 million refugees now. So just a lot, and a population of 40 million people, and 60% of them are children. So it's definitely an issue that the country has to cope with, and the educational systems as well. And it's also very diverse. So there's many languages, there's many people moving around, many ethnic groups. So teachers are, in a sense, kind of used to people being of different, having different histories, different languages, and different cultures. So also very different than, for example, if, people arrive in the UK and everyone speaks English, right? And well, now it's not exactly the case. There's a lot of migrant populations, but it's a very different approach, right, to migrants in that sense. And there is a universal primary education policy in place. So education is theoretically free, but as you will see, not exactly. Yes. So please. So that was like Uganda. So Uganda is really considered this kind of model of how refugees should be integrated. NGOs use them, this kind of the solution of having refugees be self-reliant. And it's really a case study that I think is really important because UNHCR and other organizations are really trying to push forward this idea that other countries should adopt Uganda's model. So also in the sense of specifically we think about education, so UNHCR has been calling countries in the global south to stop separate educational models. So in the past, we would think that refugees would go to a school that's in the refugee camp and they would learn based on the program of their country of origin. And UNHCR understanding that conflicts are more and more protracted. That does not make sense anymore, and they need to be integrated into the national educational system. Uganda is, well, not one of the only, but it is a country that definitely has done it for a very long time. So it's interesting in that case, and refugees are moving. So there's a lot of kind of logic behind it, but really people are moving to their cities anyway and are integrating. So if a national educational system does it more purposefully, then that would be a better approach. So Uganda definitely embraces this idea. And in Uganda, there's a law that any aid that goes towards refugees, 30% of that aid has to go to the hosting community, right? So for example, if the health ministry, there's $100 that comes in for health support for refugees, so $30 would go to Ugandans through the government. Any questions before I go into the method about the background policy? Good? Okay. Okay, so for the study, for my dissertation, what I did was I did school ethnographies of 3 primary schools, and I'll talk a bit about the differences between them. And I did mostly participatory observations, so I sat in classes, I made notes, and I also conducted a lot of interviews. So I interviewed 65 pupils, so 20 and a bit from each school, girls and boys, aged between 13 and 16 mostly, 18 parents from different countries. So refugees in Uganda come from Somalia, DRC, Rwanda, Burundi, some Eritrea, so mostly from those countries, and 24 teachers, so 8 teachers from each school, and NGOs, both local and international. And I did some visual, I collected some visual materials as well, which I'd be happy to talk about. But yeah, the ones that are assigned in blue are the ones that I'll be focusing on today. Those are the ones that I'll be drawing on. Okay, so I'm just going to talk a bit about the software before I talk about the case study. This is kind of following Ray's suggestion that we talk a bit about it, but just before we start, I think it's helpful to think about software as this helpful gnome that's really trying to help you, but it's not really sure how to do it in the best way. So there's many ways of how to analyze data, especially if you do ethnographic work. There's usually a lot of data. And then the question is, there's different types of it. You get, I had photographs and I had drawings and I had video clips and I had interviews and, some materials from the teacher's room and all of that. So there's a lot of it. And the old method, or some people still do it, is kind of printing everything out, putting it on the floor, sticky notes, highlighting, cutting it out, putting it around, and the question is, that researchers were, struggling with is, how do we find what we need when we need it? And how do we not forget where this is from, right? So I'm writing a chapter on ABC. I remember someone mentioned something about how do I find that quote? It's really difficult. So the software is actually here to kind of help you organize this. And I think this is really important to remember, no software will do the work for you. It's not actually going to do the analysis. It's only there as an organizer. Okay. Next slide, please. So what I mentioned is I used Atlas TI. There's many programs. I think other people mentioned, right? I think Rey mentioned, I think in Vivo, and some people mentioned Deduce and other programs. So Atlas TI, this is just a screenshot of just how it looks. It's also it's a qualitative software, which is very useful when you have different types of materials because you can code. I'll talk about coding in a second, but you can plug in materials of different kinds. So I had drawings, photographs, a lot of videos, as I mentioned, and I can code it the same way as I would interviews. So, for example, if I have a topic, for example, so you can see here's like born in Uganda, right? So any mention of born in Uganda in an interview, I can highlight it. But also if I have a photo of children that were born in Uganda, I can also highlight that photo. And then when I ask him to extract all the mentions of children born in Uganda, I would have both photos, interviews that mention that, the specific part of the video clip that discusses this. So it's really easy to use different kinds of software, different kinds of media, I guess you would say, or types of data, and to keep it all in place. So I think softwares generally work kind of in a similar way, that you have a document groups, right? So I can divide it by, for example, I want to write an article on female refugees specifically, right? So instead of looking into each interview and extracting those interviews and then analyzing them again, I can just click on the code that says female, and then I'll see every time there's a mention of gender issue, for example. So what you can see, so to the left, you can see the types of documents that I have. Documents or any other kinds of materials to the left. And then if you can look above, there's this tag that says codes. So I had 187 codes. I had some codes as things that I came with, right? So I would talk, policy, right? Refugee policy. That's kind of, let's say, for example, that's a code I had, right? And then more and more codes added on while I was coding the text. And then I had to kind of minimize it to make it, so I think at some point I had like 260, and then I had to minimize it to 180, but also the codes are separated. I had 11 code groups. So the codes you can see to the right. So do you see there's a kind of a column that says neighborhood location, migration route, description, all of that? So those are the codes that I used, right? So for example, in the beginning of the interview, a person would tell me the story of how they arrived in Uganda, right? So I would have which neighborhood they came from. Oh, sure, I'll answer that with pleasure, Lace, just in a minute, of course. So that depends how you define complete your research. That's it. That's it. If you could explain what you mean by complete. Do you mean the field work, or do you mean in general? So these are the kind of the codes that I would put in, and then each one below, I'll explain in a minute. So each one of those belongs to a certain group. So yeah, so these are the codes. What, I think as every person in the room who's done collected qualitative data knows, it's a whole long process that you do the interviews, then you transcribe them. Sometimes you have to translate them, and then you code them, right? You read through them, you analyze them, and you mark different parts of the interview. And what the software allows you to do is really look at the codes and write accordingly, right? So I could theoretically, if I would want to do something on informal job market, right? So you see employment, odd jobs, I could potentially open up that code and any other code that relates to, odd jobs or employment issues, and theoretically write a paper about that. So that's kind of how it works. There are drawbacks to that. I think one of them that particularly is important is that you kind of lose the context, right? So if you're looking at quotes that mention, for example, gender-based violence, right? You wouldn't necessarily see the whole story, right? So when you're looking at these quotes, and sometimes that's important, sometimes it isn't. It depends on your research question, of course. I think I had another slide on Atlas, if you want to show it. I think I did, right? Okay, so I'll answer the questions in the chat in the meantime. So okay, so I did field work. It was 6 months. It was supposed to be longer. COVID. So I got out of Uganda on the last flight out. I mean, I wish I could do more. I'm actually going back in January. I'm writing a book based on this dissertation, on this dissertation and a few other studies that I've done. Um, so it depends. You could say I'm still doing the research, but also, yeah, I kind of finished it then. Um, I did a lot of interviews and I was kind of I went to, so as I mentioned, I went to these 3 schools. So I'd spend about a day and a half in each in every week. And I would do interviews with parents a bit outside. So that's in response to how long the field work was. I did have a research assistant. I also, with the parents, I had to have 6 translators. So, I mean, it wasn't 6 translators at the same time, but the day when I interviewed people from Somalia, I had someone with me assisting translating. I had a day when I had someone translating to Arabic. So things like that that also required help. Okay, so Atlas is not free, unfortunately. You could get it as an educational institution. It depends. I just got it. I mean, it's pretty expensive, but I think it was for 3 years. As students, it's much cheaper. I think as students, I got it. I think it was $200 for 2 years. But you could use it on several computers, and and you could put as many projects as you want on it. So potentially all the students could use the same software and use the project. So, I mean, it's still money, but I think it's about $200 for 2 years for a student. When you're no longer a student, it's much more expensive. So yeah, it stays there. You can extract info from there. They're very nice. Funding for field research. I unfortunately don't know so much about like how your university works. There are some scholarships for that. I know, for example, I can't remember the name now, but there's Wenner something. It's a German fund that helps support fieldwork for anthropologists. So there are different opportunities for that. That kind of depends on your specific discipline and stage and what your research question is. So that's a broad question, but I mean, I'm Ray, please like feel free to ask, you're always welcome to ask me or write me an email and I'll try to respond. But also like you could do the same thing with a marker and and printing out the interviews, just, okay. So I prefer Atlas, but this is a personal it's a preference thing. And Vivo doesn't work with visual materials. So it didn't, so if I did work on Vivo, that would mean I would have to code the interviews and then look through all the visual materials and try to think what would be appropriate for what. And I didn't like that so much. But if you're working only with the interviews, I mean, if in the end your final product is textual, so if you have like texts that are transcriptions of, class meetings or whatever meetings and transcriptions of or discussions or even media posts, right, that you can turn into a text and everything is in textual format, if NVivo is fine. I think NVivo might work better with, it depends on which language you're working in, right? That's also a big issue. I speak Hebrew, for example. I know that NVivo works much better with Hebrew than Atlas. So it really depends on your specific needs. I know there's also a program, I don't know, did someone talk about Deduce? Deduce? No? Someone talk about it? So Deduce is another software. So it's online. You can work on it with Teams. So it doesn't sit on your computer. That's one of the advantages. Another one is that you pay while you use it. So it's much cheaper than everything I've mentioned. And you could, for example, I think you could like buy 30 days, and if you only use it 5 days, then it preserves it. You understand what I mean? So like you don't pay for 30 consecutive days. You could actually kind of spread it out. Um, it's much easier. Like there's no, like in Atlas and Viva, I think learning curve, you kind of have to learn a lot till it's actually useful. In Viva, I think more so than the Atlas, but still. And Deduce is just very, very easy. And if you have text, it's yeah. And it's also doesn't sit on your computer, but you do need reliable internet connection. So yeah. I mean, also, I don't know, I haven't done this, but I've heard that you might be able to use AI, right? You might be able to use ChatGPT for this. You could theoretically, I think, put in your transcripts in ChatGPT and ask them to organize. I don't know, maybe that's like maybe a good thing to try out and to see how it works. As you should always try to see how it works and actually look at what it does. But maybe you could ask them, please break down these interviews based on these 4 topics. And theoretically it would do the same thing, but much less labor intensive. Do you want to show the next slide? Oh, so these are the codes. Yeah, so this, I just wanted to show you an example of a code group. So this is a code that's called aspirations and expectations. So this is a group where I put all the things that, parents wanted for their children, teachers expected of their kids, what their kids wanted from their future. So anything that has to do with this, right? And I just pressed the, I don't know if it can deal, I don't know how many documents it can deal with at the same time. That's a good question. There's probably a limit, but it might be useful to try out. I mean, even if you have 40 interviews, for example, and you do it each time with the same exact prompt, like each time you upload one interview, but one transcription, but each time you put the same prompt, please divide this into 7 topics, these 7 categories. I don't know, but I think it should theoretically work. So anyway, so this is a code group. So, if I want to think about futures and what people were expecting, what happened in reality, I could just theoretically look at this code and see what comes out of the field instead of reading each one again. Do you want me to maybe turn on to the next one? Oh, yeah. So yeah, just mentioning. So as you can see, sorry, could you? Yeah. So yeah, just I wanted to show you that, for example, here I have like field notes. I don't know if you've spoken about field notes and how to keep a field note. Is that interesting or not so much? Yeah. Okay. So there's different approaches, of course, to keeping field notes. I kind of like the old style of having a notebook, but there's different approaches. There's one model where you kind of divide the paper into 2. One is actually like what's happening. You're kind of putting in all the events, quotes, and to the right, you put kind of your thoughts, your emotions that this brings up, thoughts that relates to something else you've heard. So that's how I kept it. And it's important to divide because you don't want to mistake what actually happened with what you think happened or what your thoughts are. And there's so much information that it's important to keep it organized. Another approach is there's I see, I heard, I felt, I thought. So you could divide a paper into 4 like this, right, and have it into like a grid form, and also keep your notes in every way. But really, as you can see, I think I don't know if it shows here, but I would every class or interview that I came into, I would write the date, of course, where I am, and I would write. I would do like a class diagram, and I would try to put like where girls and boys are seated. One of the schools you'll see it soon, but it was very mixed, like a lot of Muslim children and Christian. So I tried to kind of note with that. If there was a blackboard and the teacher was using it, I would write what the topic was. Yeah, I think keeping notes, you should always keep as much notes as you can. You don't know what will come up. And for example, this research that I will show today, it really did not occur to me that this would be what I will be writing about. I knew about maybe 2 years into into writing my dissertation, I found out that that's what I'm writing about. And that's kind of many times the process in qualitative research. And I scanned my notebooks. I also scanned my, I don't know if you use Google Calendar or something else, but I also scanned my diary where, my journal where I put when I interviewed who, and that really helped me afterwards, piecing it all together. Yeah, any more questions about the methodology? before I go back to the research? Good? We're good? If you could go to the next one then. Okay. So yeah, I'm just mentioning this, of course, that I had to go through an ethic, a very rigorous and long ethic process. So I got, of course, the ethics committee in my university approved it, and then I don't know if this is relevant or not, but what often the dynamic that happens, but I think it's actually true for many countries, unfortunately, not only Uganda, that, people come in very often from the global north.
Sorry, yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
We had our microphones off, so we didn't have any
Oh,
sound
okay.
coming back. So.
Should I go back? Okay, so you didn't hear me for the last 2 minutes? Something like that? Okay. Okay. So it just says, it's just mentioned that I started the ethics, just about the ethics, just
We
to
heard
mention.
everything. We
Oh,
had
okay.
our microphones off.
Oh, okay. No problem. So anyway, just, in terms of ethics, I did go through the ethics approval, but also beyond that, there was a lot of ethical questions. I'm not Ugandan. How that works, I'm an adult, I'm female, I'm white, I'm working with refugees, children, vulnerable populations. So I definitely got consent from children, and not once, but many times, because it's a traditional society. So when an adult tells a child that they have to go get interviewed, the child will say yes. They won't actually, think about whether they want to or not go into the classroom. So I did ask them many times. And I also tried to avoid, having these like traumatic kind of interviews. Where did your family come from? What they were fleeing. And I did a lot of drawings with the children. So there were some questions, but they also did drawings. I did photography. I won't be talking about this today, but I did a lot of visual materials as well. And of course, it's all anonymized, discretion. And I worked with refugee and Ugandan kind of research assistants, but they really were also cultural brokers. They kind of really helped me understand what I'm seeing. And of course, always being very aware of my positionality and being humble about what I know and what I don't know, and learning all the time. I'm still learning all the time about this, and being very reflexive and conscious about power dynamics. And that's actually how I came to the study today, and I'll explain a bit soon. How long did your IRB approval take? Could you please share the process and inform consent? Okay. Are you all in education? No. Yeah? Are you all in education? Are you all going to be working with children? No. Yeah?
We're interdisciplinary.
Okay. Okay. So I'm going to share like a kind of a broad strokes, but I don't know. It really depends. So IRB in Uganda is very complicated. I'm actually going through its process right now again. I don't know, how does it work in Thailand? I don't know. There's these kind of organizations that you have to submit your IRB from your institution with all the materials. So it's your research proposal, it's the consent forms translated to local languages, questionnaires that you'll be using, surveys if you use them, also translated into all the local languages, and many ethic questions. Okay, yeah, so you submit to your institution, and that's enough, right, to do research? Yeah, so if I was doing in my country, that would be the same. But in Uganda, you have to go through these organizations with your permit from your institution, from your home institution, and then that goes and you pay money, and then that goes to a specific branch in the government that is in charge of research. And this is, of course, there's a lot of history behind this. This is like very post-colonial kind of issues of exploitation and extraction, right? Because I'm extracting essentially a degree from people who are not seeing anything from this, and this created very problematic circumstances. So this idea of reciprocity, at least at some level. It took me a few months. I don't remember specifically what it was. And informed consent, again, it depends. In Uganda specifically, written consent does not make sense culturally. People do not like to sign their names on documents. So it was oral consent. Yeah. There's research that supports this approach, that approach. With children, of course, it's more complicated. With refugees, it's more complicated. But I think it's still very important to do this research because we do want to give voice to these people who are excluded for making decisions. Yeah. Next slide, please. Oral consent is okay when you back it up with, why. When you have, there's actually we have like an African institute in our university, and we have a shared folder with all the articles that explain why oral consent is appropriate to these contexts, and we quote these articles in our ethics committee documentation, and yeah, we usually receive it. Yeah. Okay, so the study was in 3 schools. The first one is a government school located in the periphery of the city. 16% of the population in the school is refugees. Yeah, it's a bit of a poorer school. So the next one. The second one is located in the middle of the city. It's government-aided school, so it started up as a community school, and then the government took it under its wing. So about a third of the school is refugees. And the third school it's a really interesting one. Is a Catholic. It's a private Catholic school located in a Muslim, predominantly Somali slum of Kampala. And it's an interesting school because even if I think you can see even here in the picture how that most of the girls are Muslim, and actually the teacher is also Muslim. And I'm not even sure if there were Christian children in the classroom. So it's an interesting case study. So I did mention that it came from, this isn't in the slides, but I did want to share with you because we did talk about methodology. So of course, at some point, I realized that my research question comes from a very Western perspective that we should be focusing on refugees as a vulnerable population. And also the way I am treated in some of the schools as opposed to others is that I'm an asset that refugees are bringing in, right? That I'm a researcher who's bringing in potentially money or support or whatever it is through these refugees. So this is what led me to the research. Next, please. Yeah, so just some field photos. Yeah, if you can go to the next one. Okay. So if we go back to the discourses in Uganda, I started mentioning this, but really there's these kind of 2 approaches to refugees in Uganda. So one is the one that I mentioned, that in Uganda, refugees are expected to be independent. They receive all the rights and benefits as locals, and they're expected to be self-reliant. And they're kind of, I don't know if you could say ignored by the government, but they're definitely not supported actively by the government. And on the other hand, we do still have all kinds of organizations, especially UN, but also other organizations that support specifically refugees, right? And they provide them aid because they are vulnerable. And they use these kind of scales of vulnerability. I don't know if you're familiar, but, child-headed households, families with disabilities or things like that receive more support than others. And there's this potential of resettlement that's hanging in the air. And they have these kind of schemes that are surrounding around them. So, but this all kinds of fits a model where they're living in a camp in a remote area of the country, and they get this targeted aid in a very direct way. So what happens in the city? Both of them exist, right? Both these kind of approaches exist hand in hand. Please, next one. So what I saw in my research, that some of the schools took on this Ugandan, like self-reliance approach to refugees, and others took a more UNHCR approach, like a vulnerability approach. So the ones that took a self-reliance approach were both the richer schools, so it's the Catholic school that I mentioned and the government-aided school in the city center. They really tried to, their approach to refugees was seeing them as clients, as other parents who decided to send their children into their school. And they took on, I don't know if you're familiar with this very American term, color blindness, this kind of not seeing race. So kind of in the same way, they did not see status. They did not want to differentiate between refugees and other children. And they really ignored the fact that they had refugees. And just as a reminder, these schools had 30 to 50% refugees, but this this was not mentioned in any part of their publications or in how they talked about them. And they had no designated staff or programming for these pupils. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to just show a few examples from this. So this is an NGO that, as I mentioned, that works with refugees, and it's Uganda, and it really talks about the self-reliance, right? So they talk about how Uganda having this policy for refugee open door policy, it has many benefits for the country. As a developing country, it gets funds, and it's helping everyone. So even Ugandans benefit from refugees. Next slide, please. So I think the next quotes kind of echo this, but from a school perspective. So they really talk about, this is a teacher that says, yeah, there's definitely language barriers. So many of the children, sorry, I'm skipping to that. So the question was, which countries do most of the refugees come from? So as I mentioned, they mostly come from Somalia, DRC, Rwanda, but also from other countries as well. In the region, there are language barriers, but as I mentioned before, Kampala is the capital of Uganda, and it has people coming in from all these ethnicities in Uganda who all speak different languages. So language barriers exist not only with refugees, but definitely that is a part of it. So in this quote, this teacher is saying, I feel like Uganda is able to integrate refugees in a way that is not a crisis. And, maybe even benefiting the school in some ways. Yeah, we're benefiting from them. They contribute so much to our enrollment in the school. If all refugees leave our school, our numbers go down, which is not good because the bigger the enrollment, the more money we have, right? So really seeing them as you would any clients in a private school, right? In a very different approach than you would think about refugees as kind of being a burden or other ways we usually talk about refugees in other contexts. Next slide, please. So this quote kind of shows how they chose the school, right? Refugees chose the school because it's a very high quality. So they value education. So that's why they decided to bring their children here, and really showing, again, showing this kind of way of how refugees come to this because it's a good business, and not kind of trying to downplay this idea that refugees need more support, maybe, or maybe even scholarships as they would in other countries. They're really downplaying this. Could you go to the next slide as well, please? So really to kind of maybe explain why they're not giving scholarships or supporting them, they really question whether refugees should receive any additional support. And they do this by saying many things, but one of them is that refugees actually have more money than Ugandans. So they really talk about this difference that refugees are funded. That's not for true for Ugandans. Ugandan parents have to go work. The little they get, they use it to pay for their children's school. But what I know about refugees, what I hear, I don't know whether it is true that they go and get money. For them, it is easy to pay school fees. So what they say is that because they're getting support from international organizations, they're actually better off, right? So they don't need the support, and they're not actually vulnerable. Please, next slide. And this kind of helps them treat them as clients, right, if they're not vulnerable. And here in this school, we see a very, very different approach. As I mentioned, that school is poor. It only has 16% refugees. It has very little capital or other ways to attract income. And they present themselves as a refugee hosting institution. They have staff that supports them specifically, and they really emphasize the fact that they're a school that supports refugees and is a refugee integrating school. Next slide, please. So this is just a picture of the front of the school. It has like the school mottos, but if you can see to the left on the lamppost, the sign says, "Do not discriminate against refugees." So this is really at the front of the school, this idea that they are really there to support. And it's interesting because this is a quote from an interview with a UNHCR employee, and she says that although they support refugees, they they want to support the government in supporting them. They don't want to do it directly, and their only mission is that refugees not become a burden for the school, and just being in the background. And the UNHCR, when asked them, they said they don't think that has any influence on how the schools act, and I beg to differ, and I'll explain in a second why. Go to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, they really emphasize the fact that they're refugee hosting institutions. So this is the letter that the teacher sent to this kind of partnering organization of the UN with the grades of, as you can see, it's only 12 pupils, but the 12 students who excelled in their examinations, just to emphasize how well the refugee pupils are doing. And one teacher really talks about this as a strategy to get support, right? One is saying, what is helping is we have some NGOs. There's this one that's called UNHCR. I approach it all the time. And he says that when a school has clear records that we're helping refugees, if it is clearly convinced that you have refugee pupils, it will provide you financial support. And that is definitely a way that they operate. Please, next. So they really kind of treat them as a capital in a different sense. So they're also assets here, but what they do is that they approach organizations that work with refugees, and they tell them, this is what we need. We need desks. All in the picture to the right, these are all desks contributed by UNHCR. That's over 50 desks. That's a lot. Also, I think there's more pictures of that, but they really use these refugees approaching these NGOs to support the whole of the school. Please, next. So this teacher is pointing at the staff latrines, which are also supported by UNHCR. So, but this quote, what I find interesting, I'll just read it because what they're really thinking about is that they know what NGOs are interested in is not supporting any kid that has problems, right? They're not interested in supporting, say, children with a specific impairment or children that are poor. They're really interested in refugees. So they use that in order to get support for the rest of the school. So here he says, she says, there's little support for other vulnerable groups. You know, those people, those NGOs, their focal point is the refugee child. So yeah, I would identify those who are badly off. And as I told you, not all refugee children are badly off. I would identify them, and then I would be open to them and tell them that even nationals are badly off, and I'll bring even for those other groups. When they come, I don't want them to handle only the refugee children. After I place them with the other vulnerable nationals, they offer them guidance so everyone benefits, not just refugees. That is what I always do. So what we see here is that she knows that the NGOs are interested in supporting refugees, but she also knows that in her schools, there are other kids that need help. So what she does is she brings in the support, and then she starts kind of challenging these organizations and saying, and both using these resources in a way that she sees fit, but also trying to challenge this question of whether all refugees are always vulnerable or more vulnerable than locals, because this kind of assumption is very problematic if we think about the local context. Next, please. So just another quote about really questioning this vulnerability. And he says, that some refugees are better off than Ugandans. And he said, refugees, they are vulnerable because the country is not theirs. But in an actual sense, there are some Ugandans who are more vulnerable than the refugees. There are little support for vulnerable groups except refugees. Here he kind of shows an example as children, street children, that, they were vulnerable, but then we helped them and they stopped being vulnerable. And I think that's a very different approach to what being vulnerable means, is that if we think about, these are not in refugees camps, these are all in the capital city in Kampala. there's actually no camps in Kampala. In Uganda, they're called settlements, but these are all in Kampala. So in the capital city. So what we see here is this really idea that children can be supported and stop being vulnerable, and it really depends on the circumstances. And I think that is something that is true maybe for many similar settings, is that people have lives that change very quickly. They don't have much capital to fall back on. And really, many times you can't tell the difference between refugees and locals in terms of their financial circumstances or otherwise. Many of these people, for example, who live on the border with Sudan, so I didn't mention, also many are from Sudan as well. So it's DRC, DRC, Somalia, Rwanda, and definitely Sudan, South Sudan. So many of these people have also experienced war and have been displaced at some point. So what is actually the difference between them and the refugees? And I think in terms of these Western NGOs, it's very clear who is what and who deserves to get funding and who does not. And these schools, all in their own way, challenge that assumption. Next slide, please. Could you explain the question? What's audience? What do you mean? Or do you want? Oh, it's a good question. So, I mean, I think it has policy implications for sure. Yeah, I outlined some of them here. I'll show it in a second. So I think this has implications for thinking about how we look at education, in the sense that, we always think in I don't know, in my field, sociology of education, we really always look at schools as kind of miniature reflections or like microcosmos of society. But I think here we can also see that international discourse also enters the school and also affects. And I think it's very critical to include educational institutions from the global south for that point, and for many other reasons as well, but this is definitely one of them. And that these teachers are aware, definitely aware, and I think people don't give teachers as much credit as they should. They're aware and definitely enacting. They're aware of what UNHCR says, and they're even enacting and using this in a way that can help support their pupils. And they capitalize on refugees as either clients or commodities. And I think that vulnerability definitely needs to be contextualized in global South urban schools, because it's something that changes. It's not something, even if someone was, I think conditions change, issues of illness in the family or employment or something like that, rather than, having fled a different country 20 years ago, is definitely affects you for always. But these issues are also very important. Next, please. So yeah, next is fine. Yeah. So as I mentioned, really, so that in this case, we can really see that actually in Ugandan case, and I'm working on a paper that really focuses on that, is that in states where citizens receive very little services and refugees are included, it can almost be an asset to be a refugee. So in this other article that's focusing on some of this materials, children talked about themselves as being privileged because they were refugees. Which was, crazy to think about in other contexts, right? But here, they receive more support than locals. So it could be really different what it means to be a refugee, and also how other contextual factors, and not only their legal civic status matters, right? So their gender becomes very important, their ethnicities and other issues once they're included. And I think it's really important to look at relationships with international organizations and to think about other levels. And I think we do need to, in terms of policy, I definitely think we need to, if we're continuing facing such a large number of integrating children into urban contexts, and especially in the global south or lower income countries, we really need to think about how vulnerability is classified, and to think of approach that supports both local children and refugee children in a way that's supportive of both, and thinking more about their specific conditions in which they are right now and what help they need, rather than status, because I don't think in the long term it will work. And we're also really seeing how relationships between host and refugee communities in Uganda and other places for that matter are becoming more tense because NGOs are supporting refugees and not supporting them. In Ugandan case, there's also now Ugandans who are forging refugee documents to get the support and other things like that, which really show how this imbalance that these NGOs are bringing into this field. Next, please. Oh, that's it. I think that's it. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. So any questions, please? Thank you. Fit your audience needs. So I think,
Okay, now you can.
could you maybe explain where your question is coming from? That would help me answer.
Okay. The person who asked the question, could you explain where you're coming from?
Moonlight? Yeah.
Is it Could you come to the microphone maybe? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, I could try to respond like as how I answered.
We
but-
can't hear you, 1 second. We can't hear her.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Okay.
Sorry.
Please go to.
Okay, all right, hold on. Sorry, we're
No worries,
technical
no worries.
difficulties. Okay,
I
there
can
we
hear
go.
myself.
I miss me. It is me. I'm from Myanmar, and I'm quite wonder that because I'm also quite interesting to learn from your experience and to do almost the same research style at the border between Myanmar and Thailand, and there are lots of refugees here. So that is why it's like the first question that I would like to learn is that for which kind of like audience you are targeted for, and then how do your experience of writing structures of the writing to fit the audience needs. And for me, like, my idea is targeted to kind of like policymakers in Thailand to feed the Myanmar refugees. That is why.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for the question. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, we're
Yeah,
good.
okay, perfect. Okay, so I think there's different forms of writing. One, I think you're all PhD students, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? You're all PhD students. Yeah. Okay. So writing a PhD is very different, and your audience is the the review board, that people who are going to be reading your dissertation and saying if this passes or doesn't. So I mean, there's different structures. I don't know what's appropriate in your field, but it's the committee is interested in seeing that you have read everything you can about this topic, that you've thought about how you did this research, you are aware of all the issues and, a lot of details about that and the context. So I can like send you the table of context, but it really kind of, why is this topic interesting? Kind of how I did the research, a review of education in Uganda, refugee policy, a history of migration in Uganda, things like that, schools. And then in my case, my findings chapters, I had 3. One was focused on the city and inequality in the city, and how that affected refugee education. The second chapter focused on pedagogy. So what happened in the classroom and the teachers, pedagogy, how they taught in the classroom and how that affects their experiences. And the third chapter focused really on the policies and how that affected. So I divided each into kind of 3 subcategories. So in the one that focuses on policy, I had one subchapter that focused on the schools, one subchapter that focused on the parents, and one on the children. And then I had a concluding paper. But a dissertation is a dissertation. It's kind of like there's a very structured approach, but I'm actually now writing a book based on this dissertation, and 4 other studies that I conducted in Uganda since. And there it really, it's very different. Writing a book is very different. It's a different target audience. There, it's more like really for scholars of migration and policymakers and NGO workers. So it's a very different approach. It's difficult. I'm actually also, this is unrelated, but I'm doing a postdoc. I'm currently a postdoc at University of Pennsylvania, and the institution where I work, we work a lot with the State Department, with the U.S. government and UN, and a lot of discussions about how academia can be turned into policy. And it's very difficult. It's not so easy. It's difficult getting that message across. I think in the dissertation phase, I really tried to focus on the dissertation and getting that out. And, you know, there's academic journals, but there's also policy briefs and also, you know, presenting in different forums, you know, workshops. We can always think about how to translate it back. That's a very important question. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm really interested in the case of Myanmar refugees and migrant children, of course. It's a fascinating topic, and I think there's a lot of similarities and things we can take from this. I know more like about Bangladeshi case study, but yeah, definitely.
Thank you very much for this very informative talk. And I want to start with a disclaimer. I used to be a refugee myself at one time in my life, but mine was in a very comfortable situation in the domains of the Washington, D.C. area during the Carter administration. So having said that, I also have some family. I'm originally from Eritrea. I have some extended family in Uganda, and they all generally seem to be favorable in their choices of places to be a refugee versus among those that are available. Having said that, now based on your experiences in Uganda and other places, I understand you have also studied Israel, and I forget the other countries. Would you find that this is beneficial to the refugees themselves? Does that turn them into gainful or gainfully employed citizens or fellows? Does it make them dependable, like I have experienced when I visited Northern Europe, for instance? In the US, you know, it's like sink and swim, and most of us swam. We didn't sink. I mean, well, or a good number, I should say. In Uganda, also, I think it's like more or less maybe similar, based from what I heard of your presentation. So, and then we also recommend the same system, that the Ugandan system, to the host countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your question. I was actually speaking today to someone, I was interviewing someone from UNHCR in Ethiopia, and we're discussing really whether it's possible to, you know, whether it's possible and whether it should be copied, the model in Uganda. So I think that as policy goes in general, Uganda is genuinely a good, definitely one of the better progressive policies. There are many questions why Museveni why it promotes itself as this kind of country that supports refugees. And there's a lot of political internal issues, as I'm sure you're probably aware. You know, the president has been in power for 30 years now and is using this kind of Western support for its own political gains. But, you know, if what happens is good for the refugees, so I think that's still worth it. It's also a sink or swim, and I think many people do sink in Uganda, unfortunately. So with all of that, it is very hard to make a living in Uganda. So financial opportunities are just less in Uganda, and you know, it's challenging to get a job in Kampala and in other places in Uganda. And you know, political issues affect that economic crisis. So you know, even there's the study that a colleague did on where refugees choose to go to from Somalia, Kenya versus Uganda. And many people do choose Kenya over Uganda because there's more financial opportunities there. Kenya is a richer country, right? Although their policy is pretty horrible towards refugees. So it's a question. And also I'm now doing a study on resettlement, on what refugees think about resettlement in Uganda. And people still want to very often go to the West to get out. So it's a bit of a question, you know? So I think if there were more financial opportunities, if there was more stability, it would definitely work well. And my research does not in any way imply, like what I said today, does not imply in any way that refugees need less support. It's just that the system, the way it works, I think is making relationships between refugees and Ugandans worse. That's kind of that's what I saw, that it's not very, yeah. I hope that answered your question. Yeah.
Actually, just take my chair. Yeah, so there are no more questions from the floor. And I'd like to thank you for sharing with us your research. In fact, when I first heard your research, I was super impressed because of the following. I took notes. One, the content of your study is solid. Number two, you showed us criticality in your research. Three, your methodology is superb. You showed us exactly what you were doing, and we can learn from that. That's why I invited you. In fact, you're first of the series.
Oh, really? Oh, and I'm so late. I'm so sorry.
Well, we're so glad. And then we learned a bit of how to use Atlas TI and in comparison to other software such as NVivo and Deduce. And then your title, very impressive. It's like we don't have to read your paper. It's all very clear. That's what you're doing the whole time. And then because of which you showed us how to be dialectical and show tensions in our research, not just a unilinear research. So we are grateful eternally to you. Would like to please give us your last words for our close.
Thank you so much. So really, thank you so much for having me. And please, you're welcome to share my email with anyone. Please, if you have any questions and I can help, I'd be happy to do so. I do just want to, because I think you're all before you go out to the field work, right? Am I correct? Like before you? Yeah. So I really think that for me, this journey was how surprising it is. We don't know, you come out with more questions than you come in, and you never know what you're writing about, really. And everybody told me this and I didn't believe, but it's true. Like, you really don't know. You come in with this idea, I'm going to have chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and then everything changes, So be very open. And I do think just collect all the data that you can. You don't know what will happen. And yeah, good luck with everything. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Manya, Dr. Kagan. We learned so much from you, and we hope your time was well spent with us, although it's quite late in Pennsylvania.
Definitely. Very well spent, though. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Have a great, bye-bye. Have a great day.
Already closed.
Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Yeah, sorry, because I asked who wants to speak up, and I look at everyone again and again. It's out of order not to talk. Sorry.
She's gone.
Okay, thank you. So we'll have a break. I hope you learned a lot, I hope, how to think, how to write, how to do methodology, and then don't expect you have the answer. In fact, what you expect would be different from